Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Managing Material Supply in a Changing World webinar. I'm not Dr. Sue Halliwell, as it says on the screen. I'm Claire Weisel, the Communications Manager at Composites UK. Sue will hopefully be joining us a little later on. Today's speaker is Martin Wright from Polynt Composites, who is also the chair of the Composites UK Material Supply subgroup. All webcams and microphones are turned off by default. If you have any questions at all, please type them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. If you can't see that, just move your mouse and it should come up so you can type them in there. And we are recording the webinar and the slides will be sent out to you within the next 24 hours. So Martin, would you like to begin?
Super. Thank you very much, Claire, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Hopefully you will find it useful and we will have plenty of questions at the end of the session. I'm going to run through a few slides for about 20 minutes and then we will deal with anybody's questions and points. Perfect. So just as an introduction, for anyone who doesn't know me, my name's Martin Wright. I've worked within the composite sector since 1985 and originally with Cray Valley and then by default through to CCP Composites and then Polynt. And we work in the traditional GRP end of the composite sector using predominantly unsaturated polyester resin, vinyl ester resins and glass fiber reinforcement. So just to give a little bit of overview of what we'll talk about this afternoon, I've based this on the GRP sector because this is where our business is centered and also because it's a significantly larger sector than many people expect and sometimes gets overshadowed by the higher tech end of composites. So we'll have a look at what the UK market was like at the end of the normal period of 2019, with a little bit of a consideration of some of the factors which were already hovering in the background and starting to cause changes and apply pressures to our sector. Then we can see what's happened since then, particularly with COVID-19 and particularly with the implication of Brexit, which I'm afraid is going to rear its head again. And really to look at what we have within our industry, which is a very flexible and innovative industry, and where we can actually see some opportunities for the future rather than finding a lot of negative things. Okay, so the UK GRP sector is primarily, as I said, unsaturated polyester resin or vinyl ester resins used mainly in conjunction with glass fiber, other applications with some specialty fibers or with some degree of other type of reinforcement such as mineral fillers. It's still a labor intensive industry and the average company size is at the smaller end, although we do have people within the sector from global multinational businesses right down to sole traders. One of the interesting aspects of the GRP sector and one of its great strengths, I think, is the fact that we as a business, as an industry, supply into such a wide range of end-use sectors, and this gives us a lot of resilience and allows us to move manufacture from one type of product to another to suit what the market demand is at the time. Okay, really we're talking here about technology which started in the 1930s. Composite technology goes back way beyond that, but the real glass fiber polyester business started in the 1930s and grew very strongly after the Second World War. It's always been innovative. It's always favored low to medium production runs. Startup costs are relatively low, tooling costs are low, and it enables companies to produce a wide variety of products with different properties at different cost levels very quickly without huge investment. What has happened is, because of that, it has in cases gravitated towards the cheap end of the market, where the big benefits of composite panels are not realized, and they are simply sold as a low-cost alternative to other materials. We've also, as an industry, suffered from a lack of investment, and I think this goes back to the point I made earlier about the highly labor-intensive aspect of our industry. We haven't had the money, or we have chosen, for whatever reason, not to invest in automation, not to invest in more automated, more closely controlled processes, and that has led to led to problems and has left us in places uncompetitive with some of our European neighbours. I have spent quite a lot of time in Germany, where the financial structure of small businesses is very different, and you can see that from the way huge investment has been made in automation and in the use of higher tech processing systems. And I think it's a subject that the UK GRP sector needs to address. So this slide looks at the basic raw materials come in and gives us an indication of the size of the market, or starts to develop that indication. These figures are always going to be estimates, and they're always going to be subject to huge amounts of debate, but I don't think they're too wrong. And interestingly, sadly, as things happen, 2019 probably was the first year when the UK GRP sector recovered back to a similar volume that was seen prior to the 2008 financial crash. So we've got about 80,000 tonnes of polyester and vinyl ester resin sold into the UK and Ireland, with a value of around £120 million. Roughly 25,000 tonnes of rovings chopped fibre. You might feel that that looks low compared to the resin consumption, and the reason for that is the fairly significant amount of resin which is used without fibre. You then got a market of about 6,000 tonnes of polyester and vinyl ester gel coats used in resin injection, hand layup, spray layup, to create the gloss surface on the finished components. Market worth £16 million. Then about 3,000 tonnes of polyester, vinyl ester, urethane acrylate, bonding pastes and structural adhesives, with a value of around £11 million, and a whole range of ancillaries, looking at catalysts, accelerators, mold release agents, cleaning products, surface modifiers, etc., etc., worth another 11 million, and giving us a total of just under 200 million in raw material spend in the UK. So this is the supply chain which needs to come directly into the GRP sector in order for it to work. So if we then look at where we are, as I said earlier, we've got a great lack of clean data on exactly how big this sector is. And one of the reasons for that is that we have quite a few very small companies whose reporting is not always easy to track. Quite a significant amount of sole traders and small franchise operations, particularly operating in markets like cured in place pipe work for the relining of drains and water supply pipes, and also in the flat roofing sector. But we've got a spread down from the multinationals who may have partial GRP sector within their business, down to sole traders, with the majority being at the lower end of the SME sector, with perhaps 25 or less employees. We estimate there are about 2,000, just over 2,000 businesses in the UK, employing about 30,000 people directly or indirectly in the GRP business, although some will be producers, some will be fabricators, parts of the supply chain. And if you calculate back, looking at the value of labor, looking at the value of raw materials bought in, then we estimate that this sector is contributing about £1 billion per year to the UK GDP. So not an insignificant sector at all. As I said before, quite a wide, diverse mix of markets for the finished product. Okay, so then we come on to the supply chain, which is where I come in from my chairing of the raw material supply group on Composites UK, and looking at what happens with the individual products that we need in order to maintain our industry sector in the UK. Firstly, I'll start with polyester and vinyl ester resins. These are produced in the UK. They're brought into the UK from European production by major suppliers, major global companies like Ineos, like Alliancis. And they're also brought into the UK in smaller amounts by spot producers around the world, in Eastern Europe, in Turkey, in the Middle East, a little bit from further afield. Import of resin is relatively easy. You can do it in bulk or you can do it in small containers. But there are considerations on stability and on shelf life, particularly with the more quality conscious, higher reactivity systems. So not completely straightforward. You certainly don't want relatively reacted, accelerated polyester or vinyl ester resin sat in a hot container on the deck of a ship for 14 weeks. The glass reinforcement is predominantly imported and tends to come into the UK via some very well established distribution links. Glass is a lot easier than resin to move around the world because it is dry, there are no hazard implications, and there is, provided it is correctly stored, no shelf life implications. So you can move glass around, you can store it, you can keep it much more easily. So I think from a continuity of supply point of view, the glass market is slightly safer than the resin market. Moving on to gel coats and bonding pastes, for both of those, we have a mix of production in the UK, both by mainstream resin producers and by specialty companies who are set up to produce that type of product. And we also have a small amount of import from Europe, but not so much. So supply route wise, those products are reasonably safe, and the UK market is quite self-sufficient in those. And lastly, we've got the whole range of ancillary products. And by this, I mean not just what the end fabricator is using, like catalyst and mold release, but also what the resin manufacturers are using to modify their product, pigments for gel coats, mold release, air release additives, a whole range of specialty chemical additives. Those come in from all around the world, but I have to say a high percentage are currently produced in China. They tend to come into Europe via some of the very well-established distributors of specialty chemicals, and then they are sold out. In theory, not a problem, but we'll come on to talk about reach in a moment, and potentially I can see some weaknesses there in the way the supply chain is set up, particularly when you consider that some of those products are actually brought in relatively small volumes. So we'll go on and talk a little bit about polyester resin, because that's the one that is produced in the UK. You've got three mainstream manufacturers of polyester. That's Polynt, ourselves, Scott Varda, and Deltec. with some other producers able to supply some very small amounts of speciality and slightly more bespoke products. So this is just a very quick look at what is needed to make a polyester resin and where we get it from and what the potential risks are. Firstly, the biggest one is styrene. Styrene's a globally traded commodity. It ships all around the world. The composite market accounts for less than 10% of the total volume. The bigger demand for this product is in thermoplastics and in packaging. So that means there is a very well-established trading route across the whole of the world, but it does mean that we're subject to short-term imbalances in supply and demand, which can affect the price of that product. Next one down would be the reactive components, the maleic and phthalic anhydride. And these are very specialty products used in a relatively small number of industries. And the production of polyester resins is one of the largest users of these. Now, there are no producers in the UK. So everything is coming in from outside the UK, predominantly from Europe. And there are probably half a dozen producers, of which we are one, of these type of products. The only difficulty with these is that they must be supplied molten, and that really stops any option of bringing in from deep water suppliers and restricts us down to local European business where we can run preheated road tankers to keep the material liquid. Isophthalic acid, used in production of high performance resins and also in the production of virtually every gel coat. Very limited producers. The biggest one is in China, and if anybody remembers, they had a fairly serious technical breakdown in 2017, which caused a massive shortage and more than doubled the price of isophthalic acid in a period of about 3 months. The supplier then came back on stream. The price fell to way below where it had started, and it still sits there today. It's not really sustainable, and it is a market that, as a resin producer, we have a very close eye on because it looks to be unsustainable at the moment. We then need to bring in some glycols, ethylene glycol, propylene glycol. These are, again, a little bit like styrene, globally traded products used in a vast variety of end applications. No real problem on supply, little bit of production in the UK, but not really of the type of grades used to make resins. And no great concern over supply of those other than we can get pressures come in from other markets. For example, in the winter, there is a big demand for glycols for the de-icing of aircraft, and that always puts pressure on supply for the winter months. Or you can get a change in the public demand for the type of washing powders which are used. When the market moved away from powdered washing to washing with liquids, there was a massive increase in the demand for glycols, and that caused a hike in the prices. Next one is bio-derived. This is going to become increasingly important, and it's something where I feel the UK is sitting behind the rest of Europe, certainly behind France, Belgium, Holland, where they seem to be a lot more aware of this type of product. If we are going to make if we're going to convert significant volumes of our GRP product across to some form of sustainability or bio-derived, we need to have some local supply of these raw materials. That's going to need pressure from the industry, it's going to need pressure from Composites UK, and it will need some help from the UK government. And one of the difficulties with this is that we will need to balance it with UK agriculture policy, because these products are grown, hopefully what we can use is a byproduct of the agricultural use, but nevertheless they need to be grown, and there is a big debate over long-term agricultural policy in the UK at the moment, with some pressures for the UK to become more self-sustained on food growing. So an interesting market, that one, and one that needs to be developed. And lastly, we talk about the specialty additives, which I mentioned earlier, and my concern with these would be the implications of REACH and the high dependency on China. So that's the market in a nutshell. That's where we are. That's where we sat at the end of 2019. Just started to look, before we moved on to whatever has happened in 2020, at underlying pressures on the market. These were things which have been building for some years. A change in the whole green agenda, which I think we saw coming in after many years of pressure, suddenly hitting the public eye towards the end of 2019, in a great part thanks to the efforts of people like Greta Thunberg, and underlined by the wildfires, bushfires in Australia at the end of last year, very beginning of this year, which seems a long time ago now. So there's a change in the transport market, and that is demanding lightweighting and the improving of efficiency, and that can be a huge opportunity for the composite market as a whole. Also, change in what we refer to as high performance large structures. This is bridges, this is architectural applications, the building of large blocks and buildings, where people are starting to realize, by looking at life cycle analysis, that actually a composite component with very low maintenance costs is better from a sustainability point of view than a slightly cheaper steel component which needs painting every 3 years. The move to greener energy, both in production and for transport, will favor composites, and a move away from global markets. We've seen this in the change in the attitude of both China and the United States, with a more inward-looking situation. I think the strength and the growth of China has been going for 15 plus years. And whereas I don't agree with very much that Donald Trump chooses to say, I do think he actually recognized that China was growing into being a huge global power and starting to dictate what was happening. And I think from a UK point of view, we need to be looking at how much we can do locally and how much we really want to be relying on goods brought in from deep water exporters. On the negative side, we've seen a long-term reduction in available labour. We've all started to bring in laminators, to bring in workers from outside the UK, because there is a general feeling in the UK that people do not want to work in manufacturing industry, and they certainly don't want to work in a factory which might be a little bit dusty and a little bit smelly, despite our best efforts to keep it a nice environment. We need to be very aware that as part of the green drive, which is positive for us, we are not caught up within a public negative feeling about plastic in general. And within Composites UK, we have discussed this, and I certainly think that we try to use the phrase composites to talk about engineering components, to talk about high performance and long life, and try to move our product, which is very different, away from the more general plastic. As an interesting aside, the biggest user of polyester resin in the world, biggest industry user, is the production of kitchen worktops. And this has gone on in Europe for many, many years, huge volumes of product used. And some time ago, they made the decision to rebrand their product as engineered stone, because they wanted to move away from any connection to plastic. The next one I was talking about just before I came on air which was the recycling. And the public are becoming increasingly aware of recycling, and it is probably the Achilles heel of the composites industry, because we are combining two products together, and in order to recycle, you have to find a way of breaking them apart again. That is something we all need to focus on. And lastly, we have to deal with the increasing restrictions on the use of certain chemicals. We've seen that through REACH. We've seen that in many countries in Europe and the USA, with increased pressure on the use of styrene, on the use of cobalt, and the list goes on and on. And with this type of action, where there is a potential safety implication, it is never going to track backwards. Okay, then we get to 2020, and we are hit by the biggest pandemic to hit the world since, I think, 1918, if I'm correct. Absolutely huge change to what's happened within our market, and our best estimation is that the consumption of products for GRP fell by approximately 50% in April and May, as companies were closed, as customers stopped buying, staff were put on furlough, factories were shut down, or continued to manufacture at extremely low levels. The Office for National Statistics showed a fall in GDP of 10.4%, which is huge in the 3 months to April. So that is February, March, and April. So a huge drop really before the true effect of COVID-19 had come in. I think we're going to see much bigger figures subsequent to that. We've now got the difficulty of complying with social distancing rules in a busy factory environment, and this tracks back to what I was saying earlier about a need as an industry to start looking at automation, to start looking at more sophisticated ways of processing the product that we're using. We have seen a huge increase in demand in June as companies come back to work and start to tackle a backlog of orders. I think we all need to enjoy that whilst it lasts, but be very aware that the underlying demand is undoubtedly going to be hit by the effect of this pandemic on the UK economy. And I think for some markets, we're going to see changes which will go on for a long time. I think the hospitality sector will take a long time to recover, and this does affect some of our customers. It affects people who are building hotels, who are refitting buildings, who are providing services to airports, providing buses to airports. The whole change in demand is going to affect the industry, and travel and aviation will be the hardest hit. And just at the end, the effect on baseline demand, I don't think we will know until probably Q4 at the very earliest what effect this has had on the baseline demand. And then, sorry to bring this one back up again, but unfortunately Brexit has not left us. We are racing with our eyes looking elsewhere towards the date of the 31st of December, when the UK is due to come out of the European Union. The risk of a no deal is still there, and I think we have to we have to think about what is likely to happen for our industry and for our supply chain. So firstly, we have potential delays. I think in general that will be resolved fairly quickly, but we do have to consider there may be import and export delays, certainly in the early days. More importantly, we have the risk of tariffs coming on. Tariffs are subject to the agreement of the two parties. People keep talking about going on to World Trade Organization rules. The WTO does not really set tariffs. It just sets a baseline and some template for the way things are negotiated. It will come down to what countries decide to do in each individual case between them. But if we go on the sort of standard rules, then we will be looking at a tariff of around 6.5% on any resins and any raw materials coming into the UK. Now, there is an argument that this will help us. It will make it more difficult for people to import products to the UK. So us as a resin producer, somebody producing panels or automotive components or any other type of product may see that they have a stronger case against outside the UK importers, but it also has a negative effect on any of us who want to make products and sell it outside the UK. It's not just the tariff cost, it will be the problems of the paperwork and the necessity to starting to work within a new regime. And I particularly see it being difficult for those companies who are having to work backwards and forwards across the Irish border, because I think, unfortunately, that is going to end up being very difficult. We have to look at the effect on labour. We've already seen huge numbers of non-UK national workers make the decision to move out of the UK following the Brexit vote, some of them having lived here for many years. The situation with COVID-19 has made this worse, and we've all seen in the newspapers, on the news, about the effect this has had on the agricultural sector and the need to recruit somehow large numbers of people to pick this year's crop of fruit and vegetables. In many cases, these are the same people who were working as laminators, as trimmers, as factory workers within the GRP sector. And we have to work out a way either to produce product with less people, or how we're going to attract in workers in a different way. REACH is still sat behind us. REACH is the European registration system for all chemical products, and it has been set up for some years now. You cannot sell anything within Europe without a REACH registration. And the current process of the current plan of the UK government is that they will in some way duplicate that legislation for the UK. I think they will have to do that or something very similar, because if they don't, it will make trade within Europe almost impossible, because Europe would not accept products which had come into UK that were not REACH approved and then converted to something else for shipping back out again. So REACH is going to be a problem, and my biggest concern with REACH is not with the major products where there is a huge market and the supplier will pay the registration cost, will pay the additional costs needed to register under the UK system. My big concern with REACH is for some of the specialities that we all rely on, because if you are only selling 50 tons per year of a specialist air release additive and you're asked to pay 300,000 euros in REACH registration fees, there is a danger that you might say, actually, the UK market is not worth paying that, we will just withdraw. So that's something we need to deal with as and when the rules become a little bit clearer. Lastly is a slightly positive one. There is a move again away from wanting to import everything, away from relying on overseas markets and looking for low-cost product coming from anywhere in the world. We've had problems with supply from China. COVID-19 has made people nervous of bringing things in from far afield. The push towards a more sustainable and greener future will undoubtedly increase the costs of transport, particularly long distances. So all of these will favour a little bit more local production. And perhaps as an industry which is very flexible and very able to make a wide range of products, that will be a gap which the GRP sector can jump into and fill. So this is where we are. We're looking at a decline in GDP and some long-term restrictions on what we're able to do, and some further problems from Brexit and trade tariffs and general import and export restrictions. On the positive side, we've got growing public pressure to reduce carbon emissions. I don't see that going away, and it's an area where composites are very heavily involved. And we have a central government who have already made big spending commitments. They will need to do more because they have to boost the economy to try to move the UK out of the situation that we're in. And by doing that, they're going to commit to infrastructure. They're going to commit to the building of hospitals, the building of schools, the building of major transport links, etc., etc. And all of these are areas where the GRP industry, the composite industry, is heavily involved. And when you go back to that chart I put up at the beginning, 64% of our UK market is in building and construction. So just looking at the construction sector in a little bit more detail, we still have a huge shortfall in domestic housing. That was there before the current problems. It's unlikely to go away. And every time there is a budget, one of the primary statements is about how many houses we need to build and what the government will do. If you take that in line with the lack of labour, the lack of skilled labour, we already see a push towards the modular construction of housing components where they can be made in a controlled manner in a factory, as opposed to the use of an artisan tradesman on site. And that is an area where already we have some large companies in the UK supplying significant volumes of composite product into that market. The one thing we will have to deal with there, and it is perfectly dealable with, is any change, any toughening of fire restrictions, because we need as an industry to be selling a safe product. I spoke about the commitment to infrastructure spend. There's going to be a growth in education. You can see that there's going to be a growth in what is required from hospitals and the health service, and the government need to get the economy moving again. Transport. We have a commitment to getting rid of internal combustion engines by 2035, which is not very far away in the future when you think about the huge change that will mean. Possibly less of an opportunity for the GRP sector, but I do see composites as a whole having a big boost from this, because although automotive has been struggling and is struggling even more in the current climate, the share of automotive components which are made from composites is growing and growing. And if we need to move rapidly to change over from internal combustion engines to fuel cell vehicles, to hydrogen powered vehicles, to electric vehicles, there is a massive demand for new infrastructure, for charging stations, for storage tanks, for new types of service stations to deal with the different way that vehicles will flow through. And all of these are areas where we're already seeing GRP cladding, GRP panels, GRP electric charging stations. So I think there's some big opportunities there. Then we're looking at public transport. Railways has always been a big consumer of composite panels, not only on trains, but on stations, on trackside equipment, on water management equipment, even on structural equipment like bridges, where not so much in the UK, but in Europe, we're starting to see the use of pultrusion to create these massively strong, very, very durable structures. There is a project going on at the moment in Europe to produce fully sustainable composite bridges. Lastly, the aviation sector. I don't know what's going to happen there, but I think they have some big questions to answer. Electrical and energy. Again, BP announced this week a commitment to net carbon zero. Everybody is moving towards non-fossil fuel-based energy. The nuclear debate is ongoing, but we've seen with the building of the two now proposed nuclear powered stations in the UK, that this is fraught with problems. And at the same time, solar, wind and wave energy are growing rapidly. Interesting fact there, most of you probably picked this up, that last month in May, we burnt no coal at all in the UK. And although I can see various different things coming in, I do think there will be a move towards smaller micro-generation plants using all of these technologies, and that's where the GRP sector can really move in. Leisure, perhaps not the biggest market, but we have already seen post the COVID thing a massive spike in Scandinavia in the sale of caravans, recreational vehicles and small boats as people make the decision not to travel away, particularly when we've had the most beautiful weather this spring. I think the general green environment will reduce the amount of flying that we're all doing. Perhaps we would fly once a year, not 5 times. And again, opportunities. The market for small leisure boats in Scandinavia, one customer reported a 300% increase in traffic through their website and inquiries about boats. So again, interesting, and some opportunities that may well come up in the UK. So just to summarize, we've got a huge, diverse and very successful sector, but we are already coming under pressure on some big external pressures as the whole of the global market changes. Global warming, but also the growth in strength of industrial powers like China and a change to the power balance. We've now got some specific things to deal with COVID-19 and Brexit, but that is the same for everybody. And that gives us some very defined threats, which I've tried to list below, but also some very big opportunities for our sector. So I'm just actually, having spoken to a few customers and some other people within the industry in the last 2 weeks, actually feel that we could be at the start of quite a positive time for the composite sector. So I hope that was interesting. I'm guessing Claire's going to take control now, and we can look at some questions.
Yep, indeed.
It works.
I'll just take back control. Right, so if anybody has got any questions, if you'd like to type them in the bottom in the Q&A section, and we'll put them to Martin.
I saw a couple come up, but I'm not sure how I access them at the moment.
So Ben asks, do you see markets changing where the commercial viability of products will allow for investment in automation? Also, do you see many of the smaller SMEs producing in large enough volume to warrant it?
I think it's not going to be so much a matter of having to make huge investments. I think we will get pushed down that route as health and safety requirements, as a lack of available labour moves us that way. So if the whole industry is unable to produce sufficient volumes, sufficient products of the right quality by traditional hand layup, because the labour is not available or is too expensive, then there will be a change in the commercial structure of that product, which will allow us to look at automation. I genuinely, from what I've seen in other countries, I don't think automation is as expensive as perhaps we believe it is at the beginning.
Okay, so we have a question from our own Stella. On bio-derived materials, you said we need pressure from industry and from Composites UK. What do you think are the key actions we can take to apply that pressure as individual companies and as Composites UK?
I think the government only listen when people start to put together a concrete case. So what we will need to do between us is to identify some product areas where we could switch production to a sustainable, locally sourced bio products. It needs to be something, for example, going into the building of hospitals, perhaps, or the refitting of schools, this type of thing, where we could put together a proposal that we will produce X number of window frames or door panels or something using this process, but what we need is a local supply of bio-derived propylene glycol, or we need a local supply of suitable biosource fiber. I think it needs to be done. That's why my feeling is it needs to be coordinated, because the problem is if we all approach the government individually, it's never that concrete. It's always relatively small and they're able to brush it aside. To me, at the moment, they are reviewing agricultural policy anyway because of this desire to increase the amount of UK food which is grown in the UK. And it's an ideal time to tag this onto the back of it because it's a win-win. We would hopefully be taking waste product from farms and using that to create biocomposites.
Ben asks, when you mention automation, what does that cover?
I think, firstly, we need to be moving towards, and Ben, I know you're probably quite some way towards this anyway, but we need to be moving away from hand layup. We need to be moving towards closed mold applications or semi-closed mold. I don't mean the most expensive or the most sophisticated, but something which gives allows one operator to operate several molds at the same time, where we have some ability to control the fiber pack that is put in so that it's not just being torn by somebody who's done it for years and knows how to do it really well, but it's all pre-prepared and dropped in place. And it's a more automated, controlled process, because also it moves the GRP away from that element of being just a little bit of a cheap and cheerful alternative to other raw materials, and makes it into what it should be, which is an engineered composite component.
Stella asked a bit of a follow-on, and you've probably answered it in part already. You spoke about automation a lot. What are the key steps for a regular GRP hand-lay manufacturer to take without breaking the bank?
I think I would look at the process from start to finish. I would look at which steps can be easily automated. I just spoke about, the cutting of fiber, for example. Can that be automated? The loading of product into tools. It's not about getting rid of all the people. It's about moving to a cleaner, more controlled environment. So systems like the old style of cold press, using low pressure presses and room temperature, where you're just getting a little bit more control. Some of the vacuum-based injection systems, without going to huge sophistication, but just looking at a process which is more reproducible and is more thought about in a production line type style, and less in the artisan style of somebody just going out and doing the whole job from start to finish. I'm not sure I explained that very well, but come back if I didn't.
Stella says that was good.
Thank you. I mean, just to give people a feel for what I've been to Germany, where they will have robots. They love robots in Germany, but not hugely sophisticated, really just simple vacuum lifting and moving equipment that are doing a lot of the repetitive tasks we're expecting people in the labour force to do. And I think if we're getting less labour coming in, perhaps we need to we need to look at using the people we have better, where their very human skills are really important, and taking away from them all the menial bits and pieces. Perhaps we also need to look at the supply chain. I've talked before about some of the specialty companies, about producing some of what you want in a semi-finished manner, rather than leaving all the mixing and modifying to be done by a worker on the shop floor.
A question from Brian Harper.
Sure.
What will drive recycling in composites? Do you see an increasing demand in products made from recycled plastics or recycled composites?
That's a tough one. I mean, recycling, Stella will agree with me. Recycling is a really tough one for composites. I think partly it will be driven by the end user requirements, by percentages put on products in the same way that we have today on automotive, that X% of the finished vehicle needs to be recyclable. I think we need to separate the use of recycled raw materials, which is really important, and the use of and the recyclability of the finished product. But the big problem that the UK composite industry needs to address is to find a realistic and cost-effective way of recycling what we make into something which is usable.
Okay, and I think this will be the final question for the webinar from Ben. The NCC visited recently and MPM produced upwards of 350 products per week, and they couldn't identify a product to convert to RTM as there weren't enough benefits or drivers to do so. Where does the industry go from there?
Okay, I mean, that's getting into detail. And Ben, I completely agree with you. I think it's a difficult one, and there will be some applications where we have to say this is going to stay as an artisan type production. But if we are facing a situation where labour is not available, so we're all having to pay significantly more for labour, does that change the equation?
Okay,
And
thank
possibly,
you.
sorry.
No, go
Sorry.
on.
No, I was going to say, and possibly, if that pressure comes in, does that mean that we all as an industry need to go back to the equipment suppliers and say, actually, we don't need something at X thousand pounds, but we need something at half that cost. It doesn't need to be sophisticated, but it needs to help me with the problems I have with labour.
Okay, so if anybody has any further questions for Martin, feel free to reply to the email that we'll send out with the recording of the webinar and the slides, and we'll definitely pass those on to him. We'll bring the webinar to a close. Thank you very much, Martin, for being the presenter today, and thank you all for joining. Composites UK has around a webinar a week coming up, so check out what we have planned, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, everybody. I hope it was useful.